I see a lot of people make projects and they spend so much time and so much money investing in them. And at the end, if they really don't like what they've made, it's a shame. Hi, my name's Mark and welcome to the channel. Today I'm sitting down to talk about swatching, getting gauge, and how to make sure your next garment fits you perfectly. If you're interested, stick around and let's get into it. By now, I've learned that my audience here on YouTube consists of a huge range of crafters. I have some people that watch me who know just about everything there is to know. You've made every type of project, and so you very generously pour out your advice, your support when I need guidance and when I'm struggling to figure something out in one of my projects. I also have people who watch that might be starting from scratch. They might stumble upon one of these videos, and that could be the inspiration to pick up a crochet hook or knitting needles. So in videos like this, I hope that the information I share covers that range. I hope there's something for everyone. So we'll skip around. Something might not make sense and fly over your head. Something else might seem really elementary to you. But if you're interested in spending a bit of time with me, I'll bounce back and forth throughout that range of advice. If you're someone who likes to make projects where you follow an existing pattern, you'll notice that there's always a note about gauge. So let's start by looking at some of those examples on Ravelry. I've got Ravelry pulled up on my computer, and if you're not already familiar with it, Ravelry is an enormous database of patterns for knitters, crocheters, weavers, a lot of different handcrafts, and it also has a social element to it. You can connect with other crafters, post about your projects, give notes, give feedback on the process. So for a lot of people, it's an extremely valuable resource for their handcrafts. So I'm going to start by pulling up a sweater called Flax. So I'm searching under patterns, and it's going to be one of the first that comes up here. And we're going to look at Flax worsted. This is a pattern from Tin Can Knits. Tin Can Knits has a wonderful collection of beginner-friendly patterns, and I think all of them, or most all of them, are free. So if you are making your first sweater, your first hat, things like that, take a look at these patterns. They offer a ton of pattern support. So if you get started and then you hit a road bump, they have a lot of video resources, a good team of people to actually get in contact with you to help you get back on track. So this is a free pattern. So we're not going to look inside the pattern itself. Even if a pattern is free, you should still go download it from the right place. You should go to that designer's website. You should go through Ravelry where you can click the free button. But we're going to look at the overview page. This is all public. We don't have to pay. We don't have to download anything to get here. So anyone can see this. So on this overview of the pattern, you'll see where it's published, the craft. This is a knitted sweater, and then suggested yarn. But I'm going to scroll down to the yarn weight. This is one of the first things we'll look at when determining gauge for a project. So here our weight is worsted. So that narrows us down to a size 4 yarn, a worsted, heavier than DK, lighter than bulky. And then we have the gauge. So typically a designer will take the time to give you the gauge that they achieved before making whatever the project is. So they've said here 18 stitches and 22 rows equals 4 inches in stockinette in the round on larger needles. So that's a lot of information. Let's break it down. The first thing we know is the yarn weight. We need to be working with worsted weight yarn for this. So I have some worsted weight yarn. This is from Woolstock of Blue Sky Fibers. Worsted weight, non-superwash wool that I have left over from another project. Let's say I know I want to make this sweater out of Woolstock, then I can jump in to do my gauge swatch with this same fiber. The next information is how many stitches we're aiming for. They list 18 stitches and 22 rows. If we do that, we should get to 4 inches by 4 inches. Then it tells us the texture we need to knit, which is stockinette in the round. And then it says on larger needles. So let's go back to stockinette. Different sweaters have different textures. Different projects, whatever you're making, might have different elements to it. It might all be stockinette, it might all be garter, it could be something with color work or a textured knit or crochet. So whatever we do to swatch for a project should match the body of the project, the bulk of the actual fabric we'll be making later. I've pulled a couple of things off my shelves just to show you different textures that we could be aiming for in projects. First, I have my field sweater. You'll see that part of this is stockinette stitch, where we just see the V's of the knit, but up top we have a very textured portion of knitting. So for this type of sweater, we might be instructed to test both stitch combinations to get our gauge. Next up, I have a Weekender from Andrea Mowry. The body of this sweater is done in reverse stockinette, meaning it's just the opposite side of stockinette stitch. So for the gauge of this sweater, getting our swatch, we should work in stockinette or reverse stockinette and make sure to measure that texture. One more example I'll show is color work. Here I have a stockinette texture. All of these stitches are knit stitches. However, I'm using multiple colors, holding 2 at a time, sometimes 3 at a time as I work, and that's going to change the gauge. That's going to adjust my tension and adjust how the fabric stretches and is created. So fortunately, this pattern tells us exactly what kind of texture we need for our gauge swatch. So they say stockinette stitch in the round. We'll talk about in the round versus flat in just a couple of minutes. And then the last bit of information is that we need to do this swatch on larger needles. So then we look at the needle sizes used in the pattern. There are 2. Typically in sweaters, you'll have one size for ribbing and another size for the body of the garment. Usually the smaller needle size is for the ribbing, just so it pulls in a bit and holds its shape. Things like ribbing at necklines, wrists, where you don't want the fabric to flare out, but you maybe want it to taper in slightly. My 5mm needles are currently in another swatch. This is for a sea glass sweater. So I'm going to slide that work off of the needles using one of my favorite tools, which is barber cord or stitch saver. It's just a silicone tube with holes, or a hole running through it. And all you do is affix one end of this tube to your needle tip, and then you're able to pretty easily slide your stitches off the needle and onto the stitch saver. So I'm just going to scoot these down, and within just a few seconds they're safely on that stitch saver, and I don't have to put them on scrap yarn or bind off the project. Later, when I come back to this swatch, I'll do the reverse, where I'll just reconnect the stitch saver to the end of my needle tip, and I'll slide the stitches back on. Now that my needles are free, I'll show you everything we need for our swatch. Besides the needles in the recommended size, I've got my yarn matching the weight of yarn called for in the pattern. I've got a tape measure, and I've got a pair of scissors. I have a couple of other methods for measuring that I'll show you once we've made the gauge swatch. Any of them work. There are lots of tools and gadgets out there, but as long as you have a ruler or a tape measure, you'll be okay. As I cast on for this swatch, let's talk about how many stitches we need to cast on and why that's important. The pattern tells us that 18 stitches should get us to 4 inches, so you might think we cast on 18 stitches. You could do that, but there are a couple of factors that will affect how that measures out. One, the edge of your work typically rolls. If you don't have anything anchoring the edge of your stitch, something's going to happen to it. It's going to curl under, it might start to roll up. It's not going to sit at its full stature. It's not going to sit at its full height or width. So we want to cast on more stitches than we need. And a lot of people go with creating a 5-inch by 5-inch square when they really need to measure 4 inches. And there are other people that go with 6 inches by 6 inches. Typically, I do somewhere close to 5. I like to get into my projects. I don't want to wait too long. I don't want to hesitate before starting, but it is important that I know that the yarn I'm choosing, the needle size I'm choosing, and the fabric I'm creating will work out to be the size sweater and the feel of the sweater that I want. So in this case, instead of casting on 18 stitches, I might add 8 or 10 additional stitches to that, so I get about an inch on either side of my 4-inch measure. All right, I've ended up with 26 stitches on my needles. This should give me a little wiggle room on each side of the 18 so that I have a central portion of the swatch that I can measure. Now, our texture that we need to knit is stockinette. So that's knitting the right side of the work and purling the wrong side of the work. However, our instructions show that we need to do this swatch in the round. Now, if you're familiar with working projects in the round, typically that's something like a sock, a hat, the body of a sweater, where your stitches connect all the way around a circular needle or double-pointed needles. So how are we going to make this in the round? I've talked about this in a couple of my recent videos, so if you've already seen it, bear with me, you can skip ahead. But if you're new to my channel and this video is a first for you, I'll show you how we can mock working in the round without actually having enough stitches to connect the work in the round. So I'm finishing my first row, and then I'll show you how we get back to the start of the work so that we're working the right side again. If this project were to be worked flat, where we're turning it at each row, then I would just flip it over and I would purl across this row to continue in my stockinette texture. But because the pattern specifically tells us that we need to swatch in the round, we'll do that. And the reason is, for a lot of people, purls and knits are not the exact same measurement. So sometimes it's drastic enough that you can see it in the fabric. Other times it may not be big enough to see with the naked eye, but it would affect something like hundreds of stitches in the body of a sweater. So to work the right side again, we're going to first slide our work from one end of our circular needles to the other. Now I'm still looking at what is the right side, and I'm ready to knit from this end. However, my yarn is not at that end. What a lot of people will do is carry a length of yarn across, pinch it to anchor, and then start knitting with it. Then I'm still working the right side, and I just have an extra length of yarn running across the back of my swatch, which is fine. Something that one of my viewers, Richard, pointed out to me after talking about swatching this way a month or two ago, is that you can do something else here to save your fiber so that you don't have a whole length wasted. We can pull a length of yarn across, much larger than we need, and then work with the tail end of it. So let me show that. For stockinette texture, I might need something like 4 times the width of the project. And here's where we have to do a little bit of estimating, and it might not work. So if you're going to be frustrated by that, you can always pull the length across and work from the working tail of the yarn. Let's try this way together. So I'm pulling across once, twice, 3 times, and 4 times. So now I'm going to keep that pinched, and I'm going to bring it to the side to anchor it. We now have a huge loop of yarn, and this yarn isn't going to be left running across the back of the swatch. Instead, we're going to work with this yarn. So instead of working with the tail, the live end of the yarn, I'm going to flip this over, pinch it again, and I'm going to work with this, the extra length we've pulled. So let me get my needle, and I'll work another knit row because we're still looking at the right side, the correct side of this swatch. Once I do my first few stitches, that end gets anchored and I can let go. And now I'll keep working with this extra length we've created. It's okay if we have more than we need. We just don't want to run out of yarn. If we run out, I'd have to pick back these stitches, which is not fun. And if you don't like picking back or tinking back your work, then this might not be the best method until you've figured out how much extra length you need. So let's see if 4 times was close to being correct. I'm in my last couple of stitches, and then we'll see what this looks like. I think I estimated pretty well. So that large length we had, I'm now left with just maybe 1.5 inch loop. And then we have nothing behind the swatch. So to work an additional right side row, we'll slide our work back to the other end of the needles. And this time, our working yarn is in the right place, which is kind of the fun magic of this. You only have to estimate the length every other row. So let's do a couple more rows here together, and then I will speed up off camera and finish this swatch. Okay, we've made it to the end of this row. So now we'll do the same thing where we slide our work to the other end of the needles. And this time, just as in our previous iteration, the yarn is not on the correct side. There's no yarn here for me to pull. So I need to find our tail, and I'll do the same estimation of about 4 times the width of my swatch. So I pull it across once, pull back for 2, 3, 4. I pinch and flip that over, so I'm no longer working with the live yarn, but working with the loop I've created. And I'll knit another row looking at the right side of the work. As I continue this swatch, let's talk about all of the things that swatching can achieve. The first that we've already mentioned is figuring out the measurement, figuring out how our stitches will measure and whether or not they will line up with the measurements the designer got as they were working with whatever the design is. And once we have those measurements, there are several things we can do before proceeding. We don't necessarily have to get their exact gauge to be successful with our project, but it's a really good starting point. The next thing after measurements is to determine whether or not we like the fabric we're creating. Once we have the swatch or a bit of knitting or a bit of crocheting done, we'll really be able to tell what we think of the fabric. If we think it's too dense, if it's too loose, if there's not enough drape, if there's too much drape, and then we can make adjustments. A lot of people jump into projects immediately, and if you don't take just a few minutes, maybe an hour of your time to check these things, you might end up with a garment or finished object that you really don't care for. It might just be too different from the pictures you saw on the pattern. It might be different from another version you've seen in real life or another version you've made yourself. If you're using a different yarn and a different needle size or hook size, or your tension has shifted, it could turn out being completely different. So to save ourselves some of that surprise, it's nice to work a bit of a gauge swatch. Another benefit that I really appreciate from swatching is that it gives me a heads up or a test drive to work with the fiber, work with the needle size, and work with whatever the stitch combination is. So if it's stockinette stitch, that's fine, it's pretty familiar because I knit all the time. If it's something like a cable pattern or a colorwork motif, it's nice because I get the chance to practice that on a swatch. Maybe I get better at that technique before I actually jump into the project. And I think for me, that saves seeing the learning process over the duration of my work. If I'm doing something new, unfamiliar, maybe a little uncomfortable, at the start of the project, my work probably won't look its best. But then after I've done that, whatever the technique is, for hours and hours and hours, later in the project, it's going to look much smoother. So doing a swatch, giving yourself an hour or two of time to practice whatever the stitch is, might even out your work. It might sort of up the level of finishing that you have with whatever you're making. Another nice reason to swatch could be putting colors together. If you're planning to do something like stripes, if you're doing a colorwork project, if you're doing something like a sea glass project, this can be a really great opportunity to put colors together that you're not sure about. Maybe they're stash colors you have, maybe you're just trying out a new combination and you're not sure you'll like the contrast or just the balance of color and whether or not you'd want to wear it yourself. It can be great to see that come to life through swatching. So on my desk right now, I have 5 or 6 swatches for a sea glass sweater because I'm putting together lots of colors and I have my doubts. I want to make sure it's something that I'm really going to like, and I just want to spend a little more time with all of these colors before diving into the project and maybe regretting it and wanting to turn back. Now, all of that to say, it's obviously not the end of the world if you end up with something that you're not the biggest fan of, but you don't want to dislike it. I see a lot of people make projects and they spend so much time and so much money investing in them. And at the end, if they really don't like what they've made, it's a shame because it sits there unworn. Maybe it gets given to someone else and maybe it's not their taste either, or it's not the right fit for them either. And so sometimes people are left where they'll pull back an entire project or scrap it, which is fine. It's fine to change your mind and pull back, but I don't like having to do that. I like being able to jump into a project, having considered the yarn, done my swatching, and then be happy or pleasantly surprised at the end of the process with whatever I've made. Let's take a look at our swatch so far. Everything looks fairly even, so that's a good sign. However, I can tell, holding my hand behind it, that this is a bit transparent. You can see the gaps between stitches, and that could be happening for a couple of different reasons. One, the needle size might be a little bit too large for this yarn, or alternatively, the yarn might be a little too lightweight for this needle size. The other thing is that depending on the fiber you're using, it might bloom. It might shift quite a bit when it's blocked. And that leads me to a totally different discussion of blocking. I have some videos on it. If you're someone who blocks everything you make, you either give it a bath to soak it, let it dry, or you steam it, you do something to set it using water and then the drying process, then you should block your swatch. If you're blocking whatever you're making, you should block the swatch because you want to treat the swatch in the exact same way you'll treat the bigger project. If you're someone who has never blocked anything and you have no interest in doing that, then you should take the measurements from an unblocked swatch. So the biggest takeaway is that whatever you plan to do to the finished object or finished garment, you should do to the swatch. So the first thing we did is we're working this swatch in the round because we'll work the sweater in the round. The next thing to consider is whether or not we will block the finished project, which I would because I love to block things. I think it helps the fiber settle, it helps the fiber bloom, it makes my stitches look more even. If I'm doing color work or cables, it really shifts the work after the fact. So of course that depends on what fiber you're using. This is a non-superwash wool, so blocking it is going to have some magic work. If I were using cotton, it wouldn't do as much. If I were using acrylic, it might do even less. I think that it doesn't hurt to block whatever you've made. I think giving it a bath, cleaning it off, depending on what it's been exposed to during the making process. If you have a wool wash or a light soap that you like to use with the blocking process, then it imparts a nice scent to it. Or if you use an unscented product, it at least gives it a good cleaning. So I think blocking is beneficial to anything you've made, but it will do the most for wool. So if you're using a non-superwash wool, if you're using superwash merino, if you're using blends, it could have a lot of really magical, incredible effects, after effects to whatever you've made. Part of this translucent effect might disappear after we've blocked this swatch. And if I plan to really soak my sweater at the end, I should take the time to soak my swatch. Sometimes if I'm in a rush and I just want to set it in a faster way, I'll steam it. So there are different ways you can block. You can look all of that up. There are some great videos here on YouTube. But whatever you plan to do to the finished object, you should do to your swatch. At this point, I've reached an approximate square. It's maybe a little shorter than it needs to be, but we're most interested in getting the stitch gauge. We'll also measure the row gauge, but stitch gauge is going to be most important to us. So I think this is a good stopping point. I'm going to take my stitch saver, my barber cord, pop it onto the end of my needle, and then slide my swatch over to it. This is for a couple of reasons. One, it's going to allow the swatch to lay as flat as it needs to. Two, it allows us to go block this. I could take this whole thing and place it in water submerged. I could steam it, and I'm not going to damage my needles, whether they're bamboo, stainless steel, aluminum. I don't want to be soaking those. So I've slid it onto this. I could have bound off, but I want to keep this connected to the working yarn just to show for those who are interested in pulling their swatch back and reusing the yarn in the project. So we haven't cut anything, none of our ends are cut, so we could pull this whole thing back if we need to and reuse it. Another reason I'm not binding off is because if we need to continue swatching, if our measurements are way off and we want to change the texture, change the fabric, we might want to try this on a smaller needle or a larger needle. And in that case, I would love to be able to just slide things back on, put some sort of textured row or two, maybe some garter stitch for a few rows, and then continue my swatch with the new needle size. That way, if I take this to a friend to get an opinion, if I take it to my local yarn shop, if I'm looking at it in the future, I can see my first attempt on the recommended needle size. Then further up in the swatch, I can see another section where I've played with adjusting something. So let's first take measurements before we've blocked, and I'll write all of those down, and then we'll block it and take measurements afterwards. We want as much information as possible, and we want to make sure that we're recording that information somewhere so that we can reference it later before we cast on or even during the project. Now I'll bring in my various measuring tools. As I mentioned before, you can measure with a regular ruler, with a tape measure, and then there are specialty tools that different knitting companies make. So this is a magnifying glass gauge ruler. The larger portions here are inch measures, and I can lay it over the work. Let me hold it up to the camera so you can see a bit better. I can take the magnifying ruler, lay it over the work until it lines up with stitches, and then I can count my stitches through the magnifying panel. For some people, this is a really helpful tool. One thing I like about it is that I can place it firmly on top of my work, and I know the work is not sliding around or moving anywhere. When I'm working with a tape measure, if I'm doing it in a precarious setting, the table might get bumped, the work might slide around. So it is nice to be able to put a lot of pressure down on the swatch or on whatever I'm making to then be able to count the stitches through the magnifying glass. Another tool that's pretty common is to have some sort of ruler with a window. I don't own a true square gauge ruler. I'd like one of those. I think they're nice to be able to lay the exact square, 4 inches by 4 inches, over your work, and then imagine we have the square here, then we just count what we can see from inside it. This is similar, where we take the open window and line it up at the edge of a column of stitches, making sure that the bottom, the row, is also lined up, and then we can count. However, this is only a 2-inch window, where I really prefer to measure across 4 inches or more. The more inches of stitches we're measuring, the better actual measurement we're getting. If we were to just measure 1 inch, it might have been an inch where you had a larger stitch, something happened with your tension, you were distracted, you were angry, you were excited, and your stitches weren't regular. They didn't match your regular tension. So it's nicest to measure in multiple places and across the largest possible swatch of fabric. The next thing to know is what we're measuring. This is a stockinette swatch, and so we see all of these V's, these knit stitches throughout. So that's what we're counting. We want to line up our ruler along one side of a column of V's and have it run until we hit hopefully a full stitch, but if it's a partial stitch, we'll take that into account. And then we're counting the V's across. So just to trace one out, here's a V. It's kind of a large stitch, so that might have been a place where my tension was just a bit off, and that's okay. I mean, the whole sweater, the whole project I'm making is going to look human because I'm making it by hand. But that's why we're not just measuring 1 inch, we're measuring across a larger stretch. So I would take each V across and count them. So let's line that up with a ruler. I'll use my straight ruler for this, and we'll write down the measurements that we get. So I'm getting 17 stitches in that first count. So I'll write that down. Now I'm going to move to another part of the swatch because my tension might be a bit different there. It's best to keep these measurements somewhere in the central portion of your swatch. You don't want to be right on the far edge where your stitches can get looser or manipulated. and we also don't want to be right at the bottom or the top. So I'm trying to find places that are internal to the swatch. 17 again. So I could keep doing this over and over until I'm only getting 17, or if I think I know what I'm doing and I'm really lining it up, I could trust that we're getting 17 stitches. I'll show it one more time, this time with a tape measure because it's bright and you'll probably be able to see it better against the swatch. And we're going to go to another place on the swatch. I got 17 again. So my unblocked swatch is clearly 17 stitches equals 4 inches. Now that is not the gauge we want. We want 18 stitches to equal 4 inches. So what does this mean? We have 1 stitch less in our measurement, which means my stitches are too big. This part feels really backwards when we think about it, but we want 18 stitches to reach 4 inches. If I were to measure 18 stitches, that would be reaching 4 inches and a quarter. So my stitches are too big. So for me to get the exact gauge, most likely what needs to happen is that I need to go down a needle size or even 2 needle sizes. The thing we haven't done yet is to measure this blocked. And I'm pretty sure once I block this, my stitches are going to be slightly bigger. They might be the same, but usually when I block things, I'm getting a little bit of extra length and width to my fabric. So my true gauge might end up being something like 16 stitches equals 4 inches. And then I'm way off. I'm like a ½ inch off for every 4-inch measure. So this is why it's important. If I'm measuring across 18 stitches or 17 stitches right now, in the body of my sweater, when I cast on, I might be casting on something like 200 or 250, maybe 300 stitches. And in all of those stitches, if every 4 inches has an extra quarter inch across 50 inches of my measurement, that's going to be a lot of extra fabric and my sweater will end up being way too big. So this is why we swatch. Let me block this, I'll come back, we'll measure it blocked, and then we'll talk about what we do to keep the same yarn, maybe keep the same needle size if we really like the fabric, and then how we get to a sweater that fits us the way we want. All right, I'm back with a blocked swatch, and hopefully you can tell how much more even it is. I think the stitches here look really beautiful, and they didn't look this good just from my knitting. This is really the result of blocking. And you'll still see that it's translucent. And we already know from our first measure that this swatch is too big, that our stitches are too big to reach the gauge needed. So that also might be playing into the translucence. If I went down a needle size or 2, I would probably end up with a firmer, more filled out fabric. And I might like that. So let's take a couple of measurements now that this is blocked. There I'm still getting 17. And let's go to another part of the swatch. And there I got 16. So this information still leads me to the same conclusion. I'm not getting gauge. So the next step would be to go down a needle size and continue working an additional stretch of fabric. If I don't want to keep this fabric, I could pull it back, but I would like to at least keep what I've done until I've finished all of my swatching. So I could end up with a swatch that's just longer, like a little scarf. Then once I compare and contrast the fabric, the measurements, I'll decide which needle size is going to be best for the project. So let's zoom forward and look at how we adapt a project to use a different yarn, a different needle size, if we're not getting gauge. At this point, I've brought out some of my sea glass swatches. This is my current project that I'm about to cast on for the make-along that I'm running, and I've chosen to make my version out of a fingering weight yarn when the pattern calls for DK. And the DK weight they call for and the fingering weight I'm using are not close enough. Sometimes that might be the case, depending on what a designer has used and what you have in your stash or what you have access to locally. But in this case, they're truly 2 different weights. It's a clear difference, and so I'm not getting gauge. There's no way I'm going to get it. I don't want to get gauge. I don't want to keep going up in needle size until I reach it, because then my fabric I'm creating will be too wholly translucent. It'll have too much drape. I still want a sort of solid piece of fabric. So because I like this yarn, because I have access to it at my local shop, I'm going to make adjustments and use a complete different weight of yarn and still make the same pattern. All of this starts the same way, where we need to take measurements. So I'm going to use my tape measure because it's the easiest for me to read against the fabric. And I'm going to take a measurement here in this swatch. I got 26 stitches on my first measure to 4 inches. So now I'll go to a different part of the swatch and do the same thing. That time I got 25. So I'll keep doing this a couple more times to see what our true rounded out measurement is. I'm getting between 25 and 26 stitches on each measure, and I know that once this is in a larger form and there's more weight, gravity is pulling on the sweater, things will drape slightly more, so I think my safe measurement is going to be 26 stitches equals 4 inches. We're back on Ravelry to look at this pattern. This is the Sea Glass cardigan from Wool and Pine. Once I'm here, we're going to look for the same information. DK weight yarn, I know I want to substitute that for fingering weight yarn, and then their gauge is 20 stitches equals 4 inches in stockinette stitch in the round. I was already doing my swatch in the round, so that's taken care of. Because I've chosen a different weight of yarn, it's completely up to me what needle size I use. If you go somewhere drastic, if the sweater calls for worsted and you want to do it at a fingering weight because you really want to for whatever reason, you're not going to start swatching with the same needle used for worsted weight. You're going to come down to a needle that makes sense for your yarn. And it might take some trial and error to find a fabric and a gauge measurement that you like, since you're making that adaptation. So now let's do a little bit more math. They have 20 stitches equaling 4 inches. That's the goal. I have 26. So our gauge is drastically different. So what do we do from here to make sure that the gauge we've achieved is going to result with a sweater that fits us well? Now that I have an honest measurement of my swatch, let's do the math to see how many stitches are in each individual inch. So we had 26 stitches across 4 inches. I'll take 26 and divide that by 4, and that's going to result in 6.5 stitches per inch. So I'll make sure to write that down. And we're not going to do any crazy math here. We don't need to plug in any special equation to figure this out. Instead, we're going to look at the different sizes available in the pattern and see how many stitches they have at the widest point, the largest point of the body. So that might be around the bust, that might be around the stomach, depending on the shaping of the sweater. I can't show you this pattern on camera because it's a paid pattern, but I'm going to scroll through off camera just to see what those stitch counts are for the body of the sweater. The starting point is going to be my actual size. If I were getting gauge, I would probably make the sweater that ends up being 55 to 56 inches in circumference. My measurement is about 52 inches, so I want 3 or 4 inches of positive ease. So I'm going to start with that size. I know it's not going to be right because my stitches are so much smaller, but we'll plug in the math and then keep going up in size until we find a sweater that's going to fit me. One of the size options prescribes having 342 stitches in the body circumference of the sweater. That's once we've reached the underarms and separated the sleeves off for this sweater. So if I take 342 and divide that by 6.5, I'm left with 52.6. So this still isn't going to be big enough. My target is to reach something like 56 inches. And unfortunately, that's the biggest size we get to in the sweater. Now, Wool and Pine is not creating a pattern for a sweater that can only go up to a measurement of 52 inches. Their pattern can actually go up to 68 inches. It's because I'm using such a lighter weight yarn that the measurements are now quite different. Now, what I need to do in this situation, and this is all because I'm going off course, I'm choosing different yarn, it's going to affect my gauge drastically, I'll need to keep increasing and increasing for the raglan style of this sweater until I've reached the appropriate number of stitches or measurement to fit my body. And this leads me to the next bit of information that is one of the most helpful things, and that is trying on your garment constantly throughout the making process. If you're making something top down, it's very easy to try it on. You can use scrap yarn or stitch saver barber cord like I showed earlier, and After you have a couple of inches around the neckline, slide your stitches onto that stitch saver and try it on. If the neck opening is way too big or a little too tight, you could stop there and choose a different size, reassess, instead of waiting until you've made the whole sweater and then realizing that you're unhappy with a certain part of it. Once you get to the armhole depth, that's the biggest place that I think you need to make sure the sweater is deep enough. You don't have armholes that are way too high up under your arms. And on the opposite side of that, you don't necessarily want a sweater where the armholes are way too low. You might want them to sit at a very specific point. So when you approach that point of your pattern, put it on Stitch Saver, put the garment on scrap yarn and try it on. Have a friend help adjust it, look in the mirror, really make sure you're happy with it before you move on with the next step and solidify some of the shaping of that garment. The same thing is true for the length of the body. I really find it to be true with sleeves, and typically with sleeves you don't even have to slide the stitches onto anything if you're using double pointed needles or a longer pair of circular needles for magic loop. You can just slide your arm through and take a look. Do you have too much fabric, too little? And you can gauge how the length is going. For almost every sweater I make, I shorten the sleeves. I typically increase the frequency of my sleeve shaping. I don't like my sleeves to have too much extra fabric, and because I like them shorter, the prescribed decreases might take way too long for me to reach that. So I'll do the math, I'll see how many stitches I really want in my sleeve so that it matches the measurement I like, that I'm comfortable with, and then I'll make those adjustments as I go. The biggest thing for sleeves is because you'll do 2 of them, write everything down. If I pick up a different number of stitches, if I'm decreasing at a different rate, I make notes of that, usually just on my phone because it's always near my crafting bag. And then once I've finished the project, I try to write that stuff down on my pattern just in case I make it again in the future. Everyone's bodies are so different. People have drastically different lengths of torsos in comparison to your bust measurement or the width of your shoulders, anything like that. So no one pattern, no single pattern is going to have the perfect proportions for every type of person. So I think it's so important to try your sweater on. You can do all of this for bottom-up construction as well. It's so important to try it on as you go and make those adjustments. If you're not comfortable making the adjustment yourself, you could go to a local shop and see if they have teachers or owners that are willing to help you. Maybe it's something you can set up as a lesson time or an appointment for help. And if you don't have that locally, you can probably find people online. You could reach out to people on Ravelry. You could reach out to people on YouTube, people on Instagram, whatever social space you use for fiber arts, you can probably find someone who's willing to help do some of that adjusting for you to customize the fit of whatever you're making. There's obviously so much that goes into making a garment, and specifically making a garment that fits you in the way that you like. So it's best to read a pattern all the way through, read notes and comments on someone's pattern. If it's something on Ravelry, there's a whole tab for that. And then use your judgment as you work. If something looks like it's not shaping out correctly, if it's got lumps and it's pulling the wrong way, if something doesn't look like it's going to actually fit you, stop what you're doing, try it on, slip the stitches onto something else, and then make adjustments. And that might mean pulling back, it might mean starting over, but hopefully it's going to save you loads of time, loads of money, and loads of frustration. For people that like to substitute yarns frequently and make patterns out of different weights of yarn, there's a great tool, a couple different versions of this online, where you can go in, plug in what you're getting for your gauge measurement, and they'll do the math for you. So I'm going to show that briefly for those that want to use a tool like that in the future. And then I'm going to show just a couple of things that have to do with swatching for the sea glass sweater, cardigan, sea glass projects that pertain to my current make-along. So if you're not participating in that, if you've had enough time with me today, I'm not offended if you scoot along, but for those people, that'll come up at the end of the video. This resource is super helpful and a super time saver for people that like to substitute their weights of yarn for different projects. So I'm on Knitter's Kitchen, a blog post about knitting math and recalculating your size. Now, you can go to this site, make sure that you give the traffic where the traffic is due. Go click on the link if you want to read this article and reference it for your future projects. But I'll show you a sneak peek of one of the features that's really invaluable. This page includes a calculator specifically for adjusting gauge. So you'll start by plugging in the expected gauge of the pattern, the gauge you've achieved, and then your bust measurement, and it will tell you exactly which size you should make instead of the size that you measure. So let's plug this in for my sea glass swatch just to see what it tells us. The expected gauge from the pattern was 20 stitches to 4 inches. My gauge is around 25 stitches per 4 inches. And then size information. My chest size is a 50 to 52. So I'll say 52, which then tells me the size I need to make is the size that ends up measuring 65 inches. So that's not the size measuring 65 inches with the ease, that's just the measurement, the body measurement of 65 inches. So I could take this information, write it down to remember exactly what adjustments I need to make and which size I should follow in the pattern. So depending on what results you get from your gauge swatch, you can plug it into this calculator, you could do the math on paper and then look through the sizes, and then you can just choose a size that's larger than your true measure or smaller than your true measure, and without having to do too much adjusting, end up with a sweater that's going to fit. Now, the next thing to consider is that your stitch gauge, your width of stitches, isn't necessarily going to correspond to the height of stitch or the row gauge in an even proportion. So row gauge does play a role, but it plays less of a role than stitch gauge. And if you go read this article, which I think everyone should, you'll see that that's mentioned here. Typically, when you're gauging, to use the word, when you're gauging the length of something, a pattern will have you knit or crochet until your work measures X number of inches. Usually they're not saying knit 200 rows and then bind off. They're saying knit until the project measures 16 inches and then bind off. So if that's the case and that's how the pattern is written, then you really don't need to depend on your row gauge quite as much. It does make a difference for things like color work, for things like the rate of increasing or decreasing for shaping. So if you've made a drastic difference, a drastically different choice in what you'll use, then it's something to consider. And again, trying your work on constantly will help with that. But the biggest thing we want to know about is our stitch gauge. We want to make sure that the circumference of whatever we've made is relatively close to what we had in mind. We don't want a sweater that is too tight, and we don't necessarily want a sweater that's way too oversized if that wasn't our intention. Hopefully I've shared something today that will help you in your future knit and crochet projects with achieving the perfect fit. I know that my tension, my regular gauge, is always a bit looser than sort of average tension, so typically I go down a needle size for projects to hit gauge, or if I like the fabric I'm creating, I use the calculator I showed you and the style of calculations to make a different size than my true measurement. And all of those things put together result in garments that fit me well, that I really enjoy wearing. So if you're not already taking the time to swatch and give just a little bit of thought in figuring out what's going to be the right track for your project, I would recommend taking the time to do it. I think it makes a huge difference, saves a lot of time, saves a lot of frustration. So I'm going to show a couple pointers for swatching for the sea glass projects for those people who are joining me for my make-along. If that's not you, I really appreciate you being here today, and if it is you, let's take a look at those things before I say goodbye. So I received just a few requests that I thought I'll show on camera in this video because they still pertain to swatching and making sure that you have a good handle on this one-by-one color work. So the first will be slow motion, up close view of how I'm rocking back and forth for my continental hold of the one-by-one color work. And while we do that, while we achieve it, we'll also look at securing the edges of these swatches. So I've cut all of my tails because I wanted to start fresh. I've been carrying the swatch around, etc. So I'm going to add in my main color and a contrast to get started. So if I'm starting with two colors, I just put the two tails together and I give myself just a couple inches so that they're not going to pop out of the project. And then I squeeze that to anchor it as I get started. So I'm going to go into my first stitch and I'm going to knit with both strands together for 3 stitches. This makes the project bulkier, but it's going to help secure this edge. Now that I have those 3 stitches, I'll start to rock back and forth between the two colors. I'll tension the two colors over my pinky, so just wrapping them around once, and then I will take my background color of the gray and I'll put it over my pointer finger, and then the next color I'll pick up with my middle finger, just wedging between those and picking it up over. Both are still tensioned around my pinky. And from here, I'll do my normal continental knit stitch, go into the next stitch, and then rock, just turning my wrist so that the sort of gold mustard yellow strand makes its way to my needle. Back to my regular stitch. And now this next stitch I'll rock again so that I can pull the yarn over the needle and pull through my contrast color. And I'll do that across the row. In my last swatching video, I showed a couple of other ways to hold your yarn. This is just because someone has asked me to show it again, close up and in a bit of slow motion. So to show it slowly one more time, I have my normal continental knit stitch. Then in my next stitch, I'll just rock my hand forward, bringing my fingers above the work, so that the gold strand is closer to the needle, and I've successfully yarned over. And then we pull that through. I find this to be a really comfortable way to hold the yarn, and as I mentioned in the other video, it helps me discern which yarn I'm picking up rather than having them both over my index finger, so that I can do this colorwork pattern without having to look at my work so much. I still look down at it, but I could look up, I could have a conversation and keep in pattern. Now that I'm reaching the end of this row, I'll do the same thing that I did at the beginning to secure my yarn. For the final 3 stitches, I'll drop my yarn, I'll pick them up as one combined strand, and I'll knit the final 3 stitches with 2 strands. That's going to help anchor these edge stitches so they aren't quite so unruly. The final request was to show adding a 3rd or 4th color to my swatching. So we'll start by sliding our work back to the other end of the needle. And this is again, so we're swatching in the round. And I need my main color because I have a main color. So I'll need to do my estimation of 3 times the width. It's 3 times here and not 4 because I'm only using the color for every other stitch. If I were doing stockinette stitch like earlier in the video, I would take about 4 times the width. Now I'll add in my next color. So I start by pinching the contrast color, just like I pinched our 2 strands last time. Now that the main color that I'm repeating is pinched over on the side, I'll take my next color, which is blue, and I'll add it in the same manner where I have just a couple inches of tail, and that will get pinched together with the gray. Now, just like before, I'll knit the first 3 stitches, the edge stitches of this swatch, with both colors. And then I'll set up my hold to knit this row in 1x1 color work. I'll be consistent, keeping the main color over my index finger and my contrast over the next finger. And then I work across as normal. And the only thing special we had to do was pinch the color at the edge of the row and work just a few stitches to secure it. I'll finish this row and then I'll show adding one more color, and that'll be it for today. All right, let's slide this back and add in one more color. So I'll start by inserting my needle. I like to do this first to get set up. My main color is already attached, but I need to add a new color. So again, I'll take just 2 or 3 inches of the tail, pinch it at the edge of my work, and I'll work the first 3 stitches holding both strands together. Once that's secured in the work, I'll set up to do my 2-color color work. Again, with the main color over my index finger and the contrast over my middle finger. And I'll work as normal. The only special thing to add a new color is to make sure that it's secured at the edge of the row. After that, you're fine. All right, I think that's everything I wanted to cover for today. I'm not sure how much this will edit down to, but I imagine it might be kind of a sprawling video. So if you've made it this far, thank you. I appreciate you being here. If you're part of my make-along, then I'm excited to be knitting and crocheting with you. Hopefully you've signed up to be part of it. If not, that link is in the description box below this video. And once you've signed up, you'll get a newsletter from me. I've only sent one newsletter out so far. The next batch will come out this week with the next steps, information about when we cast on, how we do that together, and any other helpful resources that I think might aid you in the process. To anyone watching, I'm so grateful that you've chosen to spend some time with me. If you have feedback, if you have your own great tips and ideas of how you make garments, how you make objects that fit and work out to be the right measurement, let me know in the comments. As I said at the beginning of the video, so many of you are absolutely brilliant crafters, and I love the wealth of information that you're willing to share with me and anyone else who reads through these comments. So, as always, thanks for being here. Happy knitting, happy crocheting, happy crafting to you, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one. Bye.